Hello, everyone. I'm just going to give some short welcome remarks. Hello, everyone, wherever you are. Welcome to this Yale Center Beijing online book talk event. My name is Carol Lee Rafferty. I'm the center's managing director and also a Yale College alum. Founded in 2014, the Yale Center Beijing is Yale University's first and only university-wide center outside of the US. We represent Yale's 14 schools in China, and we host many events throughout the year that feature discussions with thought leaders that help us better understand and help us improve the world. Today, we are delighted to have Professor Odd Arne Westad, one of the world's preeminent Cold War historians, join us here from New Haven to talk to us about his new book, Empire and Righteous Nation, 600 Years of China-Korean Relations. I also want to give a special shout out and aloha to a few of you who are faculty joining from the Punahou School in Hawaii, a school where Sun Zhongshan, Sun Yat-sen was a student. Right now, I'll turn the mic over to my colleague in New Haven, Devin Lau, who will introduce Professor Westad and moderate the event. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Carol. It is an absolute delight and pleasure to be able to welcome Professor Westad again to a Yale Center Beijing event. And I have the privilege of introducing him. I was a history major at Yale, so this is a particularly fun thing for me to do. So Professor Westad, if you are not aware, is Elihu Professor of History and Global Affairs at Yale. He is, of course, a world-renowned scholar on the Cold War, as well as international and global history. And of course, he actually started a lot of his research in the China and Asia region. So prior to Yale, he was also a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, as well as the London School of Economics. And he's also held appointments at Peking University, as well as the Schwarzman Scholars Program. So many connections everywhere around the world. I first encountered Professor Westad when I read his groundbreaking work, The Global Cold War, for a Cold War class at Yale. That was before he knew me and I knew him personally. But it's safe to say it's one of the most influential books in the field in recent history. And as you probably know, Yale has a very illustrious history department that's long been considered one of the best, if not the best, in the world. And just as an example of how influential Professor Westad is, before he officially joined Yale, he gave a talk at Yale. And I've never seen such a collection of the best professors at Yale attending a talk by somebody else. It was incredible, the range of professors that showed up to hear him give this talk. So as further evidence of his incredible influence, he, after publishing his famous Global Cold War book, he has had many influential books after that. He's been an editor for the Cambridge History of the Cold War, as well as the author of the Penguin History of the World series, both very influential in their own right. And I personally find it quite incredible the way Professor Westad is able to zoom in and out within his research. And so he's focused on China and the region of Asia. And then he goes and talks about the whole world and international history. And then he goes and zooms back in on Asia. And it's just constantly coming in and out. And if you're in the field, you know that that's an incredibly hard thing to be able to do both well. And so, for example, he published Restless Empire, China and the World Since 1750, returning back to Asia. But then he went and decided to do the Cold War, a world history. And so he zooms out. And then now he's coming back to Asia with his newest book, talking about the latest 600 years of China-Korea relations. And so I am very excited to hear his talk about this book, and we are very honored to welcome him once again. So Professor Westad.
Thank you very much, Devin, for that very generous introduction. And thank you, Carol, for inviting me to do this, and everyone at the Yale Beijing Center. So, of course, I wish I could be with you in person in Beijing, which would have been much more fun than speaking from my study here in New Haven. But that's the way things are these days. And the big advantage is that you can be quite literally several places at the same time using the kind of technology that we have now. And over the last few weeks, I have made use of this in terms of speaking to Yale alumni and others in various parts of the world. So there are advantages to this as well, even though there are sorry circumstances that have made this necessary in terms of how we are setting these things up. So I'm very glad to be with you this morning, Beijing time. What I'm going to do is just to present relatively briefly, I'll speak for about 25 minutes or so, the basic tenets of this new book that I'm publishing on China and Korea. It's a book that I finished last fall. I spent most of the spring in Beijing, as Devin said, at Tsinghua at the Schwarzman College. I did a lot of research for this book, then particularly on the more recent parts of the book. The origin for the book was in a set of lectures I gave at Harvard back in late 2018. So I've been developing these and expanding them into a book form. But for those of you who like short books, and as Devin indicated, I'm not a master of doing short books, but this is a short book. This is a small book on a very, very big subject on China and Korea over 600 years. And the reason I did it was to try to pull together a lot about what we know about what I think will be one of the central relationships of international affairs over the next generation. So I'm the historian, as you heard, but I'm the historian who has a particular interest in contemporary international affairs. So I try to understand where we are today based on at least some of the elements of the past. And if there is one international relationship that I know of where the past plays an outsized role, it is in the relationship between China and Korea. So I don't have to tell all of you why that relationship is important, why it has been important for some time, but also why it will be important going forward. The ongoing crisis on the Korean Peninsula will be with us, I think, for quite some time. China's significance in terms of international affairs is only going to grow. And the relationship between China and the United States, the two major powers involved on the Korean Peninsula, is, from what we can see today, not going to be much better anytime soon. I hope it will be better, but my prediction is don't bet on it. And that will create a situation around the internal conflicts that exist on the Korean Peninsula, which will make the situation very, very tense over a long period of time with a lot of international implications. Maybe first and foremost for China, but also for the United States. So this book is divided into three parts. So in the first part, I look at the origins in the modern era, what I would call the modern era, of the relationship between China and Korea, or the Joseon state as Korea was back then. So I start the book in the late 14th century. And as many of you will know, there is good reasons for doing that. So both China and Korea went through tremendous transformations back during that era. So China got its new empire, its new dynasty, the Ming, after the end of the Mongol domination of China. And Korea, roughly at the same time, established the Joseon state, a state that would prove tremendously successful and last in Korea right up to the 20th century. So some people have been wondering about the title for this book, Empire and Righteous Nation, and why did I choose these terms? So let me just explain a little bit about that, just to explain my angle of understanding of the relationship between China and Korea first. So righteous obviously refers to Korea, but I don't mean by that all Koreans are righteous, or even that the Korean state at any form or any point has been a particularly righteous state. It is there to indicate that the search for a righteous approach to domestic and international affairs has preoccupied generations of Koreans very much. So when I say righteous, those of you who speak Chinese, the term is Yi, the Confucian term for righteousness. We in Korean. And we will see this theme coming back again and again in the history of the Joseon state, but also in the history of how Korean elites have understood themselves. The second concept is the concept of empire, and that's perhaps less difficult to understand. China has, for most of its existence, in one form or another, been an empire, and the two incarnations of empire that I deal with in this book are the Ming and the Qing. So in the book, when you turn to it, I hope you will read it, you will find a discussion of what constitutes an empire, because empire in China or in the Chinese area, just like empire everywhere else, comes in different forms. There are some common traits. I mean, going back to the Assyrian Empire in the second millennium BC, central authority has to be there for it to be an empire, and also a systematic form of thinking to regulate the relationship between center and periphery, I think also has to be there for it to be an empire. But almost everything else is up for grabs. So some empires colonize. Think about European empires, maybe first and foremost. Think about Ireland, settled by the English, controlled by it for a very long time. Algeria, settled by France. Korea is in many ways similar in terms of being on the borders of an imperial center in China. But in Korea, as you will know, Chinese settlement historically has been very rare. The only real attempt at settling foreign colonials in Korea was by Japan during the early 20th century, when almost 1 million Japanese settled there for a relatively brief period of time. So in the book, I go through different types of Chinese empires, try to find out what they have in common and what the differences are. So for the differences, I'm afraid you have to read the book. For the similarities, it seems to me that there are two that really stand out, going deep into Chinese history. One sense that these empires have in common is the sense of cultural centrality within the wider region. Particularly a cultural centrality towards Korea and Japan, but also towards a wider area. And the second similarity with all Chinese empires that I know of is an emphasis on hierarchy. And through the thinking about hierarchy, an emphasis on bureaucratic governance of various sorts, just like in today's China as well. When we talk about nation for Korea, and again, I won't spend much time discussing this now, we can talk about it in the Q&A afterwards. There's a huge discussion about whether it's correct to use the term nation for Korea, particularly in the very early modern era. So the Ming and the Qing were many things, but no one can imagine them as nations. I mean, they were empires with many groups within them under one predominant elite and culture. In Korea, on the other hand, the emphasis, it seems to me, from very early on, is on what brings Koreans together in linguistic terms and in cultural terms, in ways that, if it's not identical to how we think about a nation today, it's pretty close to it. In terms of language, for instance. So modern Korean derives from Middle Korean, which in turn derives from, you may have guessed it already, Old Korean, which has its root in some form of Proto-Korean. So there is a long duration here, long line of connections that are quite distinct within the region. Now, not everything that is distinct becomes a nation. But I do think that in the Korean sense, there is an emphasis on what we might term national cohesion, going way back in time, very different from what you find in China, and much earlier than what you find in Japan. So why this emphasis on righteous then? Well, one reason, as I already mentioned, is the slogan form that this took on the Korean side during the Joseon state and after, in the 20th century as well, when Koreans were fighting against Japanese colonialists. Very often the term righteous was used as a kind of slogan directed against the Japanese. And I think part of this has to do with cultivating one's own significance within a setting where there will always be fewer Koreans than Chinese or Japanese, or many other countries, by the way, in an Asian context. But it also means something more than that. There's an emphasis on moral fitness. There is an emphasis on loyalty. There is an emphasis on fidelity to principles. All of these, as you will know, Confucian concepts that came to Korea and was revitalized in Japan roughly at the same time as my story starts. So the rest of the first part of the book deals with the development of these relationships. What you could call a Neo-Confucian revolution in Joseon, in Korea, which very much remade not only the state, but also much of the society. The joint resistance of the Ming and the Joseon against Japanese expansionism in the late 16th century, what some people have called East Asia's First World War, which certainly had enormous consequences for all of the three countries involved. But also the relationship, the overall relationship that was there between China and Korea, both during the Ming and during the Qing Empire. So again, as many of you will know, Korea had a relatively complicated relationship, both with the Ming and the Qing. Maybe particularly with the Qing. The Koreans regarded themselves as better Confucians, better trained in traditions and correct, righteous settings than what the Qing dynasty was regarded both by Koreans and many Chinese as a foreign dynasty. So there was a certain sense of superiority in cultural terms that developed during Qing days. It is important, though, that this relationship changed over time. So when you get to the 18th century, the Joseon, the Koreans have more or less made their peace with the Qing. It's been fascinating for me to read Korean literature from that era, because one of the things that they underline is how even this foreign dynasty that had taken control of the central state, the Middle Kingdom, has now taken up the traditional virtues and the traditional approaches to how to understand state building and developing a good society, and become quite good at it. So by the time the 19th century comes about with all of its challenges, the relationship between the Joseon state and the Qing is actually reasonably good. So it is a tremendous shock in Korea, maybe more than within the Qing Empire itself, when the Qing then start losing out to European Western challenges and then eventually to Japan during the 19th century. So when I teach this stuff at Yale, I often read to my students a text by a Korean Confucian scholar from the early part of the 19th century, a guy called Elihu, which in Chinese would be Li Hongluo. And this is what he says. This is written in the 1820s, I think, so before the Opium War, but when the Western presence is starting to be felt in Eastern Asia. And he tries to make sense of this from a Korean perspective, reflecting on the relationship between Chinese civilization and the outside world. And I'll read parts of it to you. So he said, quote, "When Chinese civilization encounters a barbarian people, The barbarians are transformed by Chinese ways into a civilized people. Barbarians look up to China and are delighted to receive its civilizing influence. This is the way things are. This is the natural order of things. This is the way human beings ought to feel. China is like the root, a plant supplying nourishment for the branches and leaves. It is like the hands and feet that protect the belly and chest of the human body. This can never change. These Europeans come from a land far away from China, so it's only natural that their customs are quite different from Chinese customs. Like children of peasant households, though they study Confucian writing as hard as they can never grasp the structure and organization of those writings, as well as children from families that have been studying Confucianism for generations. The heavens are so vast, he says, that the universe appears boundless. Yet we can locate the center of the universe, the point around which it revolves. That is the North Star. The Earth is also quite large, extending so far in all directions that it too appears infinite in size. Yet it also has a center, the site from which the entire Earth is governed. That terrestrial center is China. And it goes on in this direction. So the reason why I like this text is that he summarizes what had become the relationship between China and Korea up to the 19th century. It was not a relationship that was without conflict, but it was a relationship between a central state, which was China, and a vassal state that was Joseon or Korea, under which the Koreans had learned to work quite well. So the shock when that order is entirely overthrown in the late 19th century and early 20th century is immense for China-Korea relations, but also for the whole region. It is, as you will know, the relationship to Korea that leads to the first Sino-Japanese War in the 1890s. And then, as a result of that war, the colonization of Korea by Japan. So this is also something that I write a great deal about in the book. So the final part of the book deals with the relationship between China and Korea over the last couple of generations or so. My students have already started joking that this is a book in three parts. So the first part deals with China and Korea over 500 years. And the second part deals with China and Korea over 100 years. And then the final part deals with China and Korea over the last 2 weeks or so. And that's not entirely true, but the last part does deal with the birth of Korean nationalism, with the setting up of the two Korean states, the effects of the Second World War, both for Japan and Korea. And then, of course, the framework that has now come into being since the Korean War in the 1950s, which is a communist state in North Korea that at least originally very much based itself on Chinese and Soviet presidents, and a democratic, eventually, first a dictatorship, then a more democratic state, and now even a liberal state in South Korea that has much more of a close connection to the United States, but also to other democratic countries. So this is in a way the division line that has been there now since the 1940s. I think it's important to underline two things for the audience that we have today with regard to this relationship. So, as you will know, for China as well as for Korea, to some extent the United States, the Korean War was a definition, in a way, of the kind of international relations that was going to develop since then, at least for a very, very long period of time. Not only did it ensure that Korea would stay divided, but it also led to a very high degree of enmity between the United States and China, which it took another generation to try to get rid of, to get some kind of cooperation going. But it also led to the kind of situation that we have today, which I think you can only understand on the basis of Korea's experience being colonized by Japan and the growing up in exile of two very strong, very nationalistic kind of ideas about Korean modernity, what Korea was going to be like in the future. So this concept that you often see, including in China, of the division of Korea being entirely imposed from the outside is something that I'm slightly skeptical towards. I think it also came out of what you could call a civil war in Korea that was there well before the Korean War, and was about rival visions of what Korea was going to be like in the future. And that persists, in my view, even today. That's the reason why the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, has survived for as long as it has, in spite of the economic challenges that it's had and the security challenges, is that for some people, well beyond the Kim family in power, believe that North Korea is the last best hope of Korean nationalism. But then, likewise, in the South and in the different traditions of Korean nationalism that are now manifested in the Republic of Korea, there is the absolute conviction that it's only their form of nationalism connected to democracy, and of course tremendous economic growth that you've seen in South Korea, that will be the future for the Korean nation. Now, I think from a Chinese perspective, the big challenge now is, of course, first and foremost to try to avoid another military conflict in Korea, which would be disastrous for the whole region and for the world. To try to deal in some way or another with the North Korean nuclear program, which in my view, and this is something we can discuss later on, simply should not go on in the way that it does now. In spite of those, many my colleagues who are saying this is a done deal, there is nothing we can do to roll back the North Korean nuclear program. My view is that the whole region would be way safer without that program in place. And of course, we know it's only a cooperation between the United States and China that will make it possible for that program to be phased out over time. The other aspect has to do with what will happen politically on the Korean Peninsula, and that goes much beyond the nuclear program in itself. Korea has been a unified country for a very, very long time. The idea of Korea being divided into two separate parts is entirely new. China has been divided, if you think about it historically, for far longer periods than what Korea has. So I don't think the current situation in Korea is going to last. We don't know what is going to happen in the immediate future. We don't know when Korean reunification will happen, but I'm pretty sure it will happen. The big question for the rest of us, for that matter for the Koreans themselves, are the circumstances under which it would happen. And I end the book on that note. I'm deeply worried about another conflict on the Korean Peninsula. I'm deeply worried about the lack of cooperation that you find now between China and the United States, and Japan for that matter, over Korean affairs. And I can easily foresee ways in which that turn towards a reunified Korea could not necessarily be the kind of hope and dream that so many Koreans have of a peaceful reunification. It could become a very conflicted, very turbulent period for Korea itself and for the rest of the world. But this depends very much on decisions not just taken in Pyongyang and in Seoul, but also taken in Washington, and not least in Beijing. So that's what this book is about, Carol and Devin and everyone else. And I'd be very happy to take questions and to hear what others have to say.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I guess we can transition into a question and answer time. I do ask that if you could turn on your video, everybody else, that way Professor can have a good sense of who he's talking to instead of just a whole sheet of blank screens. That would be nice. You know, as Professor mentioned, the nice thing about Zoom is you can be everywhere in the world at once, but it does create a barrier of communication sometimes if we don't know who we're talking to. If people have questions, one of the things you can do is type out the question into the Zoom group chat. So there should be a chat function on the bottom. You can go ahead and type your questions there, and as they come up, we will try to ask them. And the other thing you can do is, if you look at the participants button, there should be an option to raise your hand as well. So if you have a question, you can either type it out in the group chat, or you can raise your hand in the participants role, and I will do my best to call on you in a timely manner. And I do ask that if you are asking a question, it would be ideal if you could turn on your video so that the professor can see who he's talking to. Great, so I see that we already have a question, which is good. I'm going to unmute you and you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, I'm from Beijing. So my question is that a lot of research has been done in these areas. So I was wondering, how is the professor's research and how is book different from others? What kind of different angle he can see that we don't see? Say, what kind of different point of view the Chinese scholar don't see and he sees that?
Great, thank you.
It's a good question. I think the biggest discovery that I did when I was working my way through this is simply about the closeness of China and Korea. I mean, in cultural terms, that has been dealt with reasonably successfully, I think, by other authors, not least Chinese historians and scholars. But in political and ideological terms, perhaps a little bit less so. So that remarkable closeness is one of the threads through this book. How Koreans and Chinese have been preoccupied with the same things for centuries, but in slightly different forms. And the second part, which I mentioned, but maybe a bit too briefly to begin with in my talk, is this very complicated relationship between the empire and the nation. So why is the Chinese imperial states, because as I said, they came in different incarnations, relationship to Korea, which is obviously a vassal state, it's a state that it's politically connected to the empire, so different from what you would find to China's relationship to other states, other countries, other groups, peoples in the region, but also very different from what you find when you look at other empires in the Middle East, in South Asia, Russia, Europe, in their relationship to their vassals. For instance, why is there no attempted colonization or colonial settlement? Why is there so little interference over a long period of time by the central imperial authorities in Beijing and Nanjing towards Korea during this period? And there have been different answers to that. I mean, some people are emphasizing, that the emperors thought of Ming and Qing, most of them, were sensible enough to leave well enough alone, right? When the relationship was going reasonably well, why interfere in it? But there is another side to this as well, and that is which is very relevant, I think, for today, which is the very successful management of the imperial center that the Korean leaders carried out over generations. So some of that you will see in action today as well. I got this very strong feeling in writing this book that at all points in this relationship, the Koreans knew much more about China than vice versa, and were able to employ that knowledge, that tradition, that background, in order to gain advantages that otherwise would have been really difficult to get from a much more powerful neighbor and center.
So there's a can I ask the further question? So I was wondering, is there any areas that you find the Chinese scholar ignored and you find it's actually quite important?
So I think it differs. I mean, I think many Chinese scholars have a tendency to look more at the China side than the Korea side of this relationship. I mean, particularly with regard to how the imperial framework worked. I mean, it's not only true for Chinese scholars, it's also true for some Western scholars who I think are, in part for language reasons, but also perhaps in terms of how their training has been, much more preoccupied with what the empire does than what its neighbors actually do. So I do think that there is, including in today's China and today's PRC, a sort of dissonance with regard to this. It was very interesting. I gave a talk at Beida about this project in its early phase, and I had made sure to specifically invite the Korean Students Association at Beida. So there were a lot of Koreans in the audience as well, which led to some really interesting discussions between Korean and Chinese students about how Korean history and the relationship between the two is actually understood in China, and how it's taught at a university like Beida. I thought that was quite interesting.
Okay, thank you.
Great. We have a question from Zhang Wen, which I think is, you hinted at some of the things, but I'll unmute Zhang Wen to ask the question. Zhang Wen, go ahead.
Yes, hello, Professor. Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Oh, thank you. Yes, because you mentioned about the shock in the 18th century between the two countries. So I wonder, can I relate your idea to the trade history, to the tributary system change to the treaty system in the 19th century? Yes, please. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's one of the things that I would have covered in the introduction if we had more time this morning. So I've for some time been of the opinion that you have to be a little bit careful with the concept of a tributary system or a tribute system. Not so much because of the tribute. So I mean, there's definitely tribute involved in most of China's foreign relations with surrounding countries, meaning that the leaders of these countries, in order to have any kind of relationship with the Ming or the Qing, would have to appear in Beijing or Nanjing for a short period at the imperial court with gifts that were presented and to show their subservience to the imperial center. So tribute, yes. System, so like in tribute system or tributary system, of that I'm less certain. One of the things that both the Ming and especially the Qing were very good at was to deal with different neighboring countries differently, according to the kind of format that existed in the relationship between the empire and the states. So the idea that there is a kind of centralized format, sort of one size fits all, at least basic approach that is there, in the form of a tribute system is something I'm skeptical of. I like to joke that since it was John King Fairbank and some of his students who started developing this concept of the tribute system, that I always argue that the tribute system has been stronger at Harvard than what it's ever been in China. And I think that is true to some extent. So we have to, this goes back to the last question. It's a very good connection, actually. We have to study all of these relationships today and in history individually. We have to look at what is this for China's borders. So the wider world is a different story. But if you look at these countries that China has interacted with for a very long period of time, there isn't a kind of one-size-fits-all approach. One of the strengths of China's approach has been that these countries are dealt with, as the Qing would have said, according to their own characteristics. Right? The differences are as important as the similarities. And that was part of the success, frankly, from a Chinese perspective, that they were able to break out of this idea that everyone should be dealt with similarly. I often use, there are these wonderful excerpts, some of you will have read this, probably read it before I did, of the Qianlong Emperor's diaries, which are mainly official engagements, but there are some fascinating private notes in between them, where he stresses the need to understand the differences between all of these different peoples that surround China. That's what he had learned, from his grandfather, the great Kangxi Emperor. They all have to be dealt with according to their own characteristics. So the idea that you do not differentiate is entirely wrong in this sort of hierarchical approach that exists to foreign relations in traditional China.
Great. I feel like we can probably keep going down that path if we wanted to, but we'll see what other questions we have and maybe come back to that. Shah Bento, here we go. Let me see.
Westad, for your presentation today. Very interested in the latter part of your book, I guess the third part. And I'm looking at the reunification of Korea and the influence of the trilateral relationship between North Korea, primarily, China, and Russia. And can you possibly give us a feel for that relationship in terms of China and North Korea developing similar policies towards its northern neighbor?
Yeah, I think this is one of the challenges, I think, in terms of understanding North Korea for short today, is in terms of how it will develop its own foreign affairs and its directions. We know that in spite of the fact that China is the only country that has a reasonable relationship with Pyongyang, there isn't much love lost between the leaderships in the two countries. I was able to speak to a lot of people who had been involved in dealing with North Korea when I was in Beijing last year, and I think that is pretty clear. And of course, there have been crises recently, which I go through in the book, where the kind of rhetoric that the North Korean regime has used against China is quite striking. I mean, going out of the way to underline the strength of their own nationalism, going back to things that I mentioned earlier on in the talk, and the wayward approach of China. At one point, this is now only 2.5 years ago, being accused officially in Pyongyang of prostituting itself in order to get more advantages from the Western world, right? So this relationship is a complex relationship. So the many people in the United States in particular who think that North Korea is somehow some kind of Chinese creation have got this relationship also entirely upside down. China, North Korea is in many ways as much of a problem for China as it is for everyone else. When it comes to Russia, so I was giving a version of this talk plus a couple of other items thrown into an audience in Moscow earlier this week. And it was really interesting to see the kind of reaction that was there then. I think for today's regime in Russia, so Putin's leadership, there is increasing interest in reasserting a Russian role with regard to the Korean Peninsula, but very few ideas about how to actually do this. And a deep fear of getting entangled in a complex relationship that Russia will not actually benefit from in any way. As with so much of contemporary Russia's foreign policy, the country is pulled in two different directions at the same time. On the one hand, there are people close to Putin, it seems, who believe that through reawakening some kind of old links to Pyongyang, Russia could get more of a role to play with regard to Korea in general, the strategic situation in Northeast Asia. But then there are probably more people who are telling the leader that that's exactly what they should not do, that South Korea is far more important to Russia than what North Korea will ever be, and being seen as some kind of upholder of the North Korean regime in Seoul, in South Korea, could be absolutely deadly for Russian attempts at attracting business with South Korea, attracting South Korean investments. So I still think these are the people who have the upper hand. That question, by the way, is not all that different seen from Beijing, right? Some of the same dilemmas are there, but Beijing have more strength, more influence, and of course, as we've seen in the talk that I just given, more history with regard to the region.
All right. We have a two-part question from Jean Sun. Go ahead.
So may I speak now?
Yes.
Thanks very much for your presentation today. The only pity is it's very short. And we have so many questions, interesting questions inspired by your lecture. So I have number one question, which is a question about the late 19th centuries. So how do you look into the notion of the development of the rightness and the legality of the Korean's independent foreign policy, which intends to keep a relative distance from Beijing? And the second question is, then how do you look into this new development of the notion of this rightness around the end of the Cold War, and might it make an impact on, for example, the nuclear policy of two Koreans? Because both of them have some nuclear policies in different attempts. So thank you.
Yeah, no, those are two very good linked questions. I think the idea that Korea, in whatever form Korea has existed or will exist in the future, will have a relationship to a Chinese state that is just based on being a neighbor. That, I think, is completely impossible. There is too much history in this relationship for that to be a valid kind of development. So these more traditional concepts, which righteousness, in this form perhaps more about correctness, some people would even say rectitude, than about the more philosophical fundamentals of righteousness, is something that is forever going to play a role with regard to that relationship. I mean, I spent quite a bit of time in South Korea, and it's very interesting to see how that still plays out with regard to the relationship to China. South Koreans, especially younger South Koreans, do expect China to play a positive role with regard to the eventual reunification of their country. That's righteousness for them. That is what is correct. That's how the predominant power should behave. It should help a smaller country with long historical links to China overcome its problems. And when there is a feeling that I think many young South Koreans have today, that China today in some ways not contributing to that process through its relationship with Pyongyang, then there is a dissonance that I think will have political consequences in the longer term in terms of relations between Seoul and Beijing. On the second part of the question, so the nuclear issue itself in this particular light. So that's a very interesting question, because so one of the reasons why I disagree slightly with received wisdom on both sides of the aisles as well in Washington these days, that the North Korean nuclear program is here to stay. You can reduce it, you can control it through arms control, but you cannot end it or abolish it, has to do with the North Korean regime's self-identification, how it understands itself. So for most people, including a lot of people, I must say, in South Korea, the idea that nuclear weapons is something that Pyongyang, that the Kim family has achieved as a form of self-defense is very hard to understand. But I'm not so sure that you should entirely rule that out as part of the issue, right? It is a very aggressive form of self-defense, but it is their way of saying, you know, don't mess with us. We understand ourselves as being the last best hope for the Korean nation. That most Koreans, I think, disagree strongly with. That is another matter. So that, in other words, if the future of Korea, the long-term possibilities on the peninsula would in a way become contrary to the continuation of such a nuclear weapons program, I think there would be possibilities of it actually being used as a bargaining chip. But it would be incredibly difficult to get from here to there. And without China and the United States cooperating, it would be entirely impossible. But ruling it out, I think, would be wrong. Both because it's too dangerous to be left in the form that it has now for everyone, but also because I'm not sure that all the possibilities for actually dealing with that program in terms of North Korea's own future has been ruled out.
Thank you. All right. Anybody else have any more questions? If not, I'm going to start asking questions. Feel free to either type them in the chat box or raise your hand. I guess my personal interest or bent tends to be more on the cultural, philosophical, intellectual side. Mm-hmm. I find it curious your choice of your title and starting right away with Righteous Nation. You know, and the influence of Confucianism, and you hear it often said that Korea is a much more Confucius country than China is now. So I guess I'm curious how explicit or implicit are these effects of Confucianism on, I guess, South Korea, North Korea, and China, and sort of how do you see that impacting the way they relate with each other? As well as, since I'm based in the US, how the US does or does not understand how to deal with them.
So the latter point, as you know, Devin, is the easiest one to answer. The understanding of this particular moral philosophical universe from an American perspective is very, very limited. I tried to argue both here at Yale and when I was up at Harvard that if there is one political philosophy that all American Foreign Service officers ought to spend some time studying, it is Confucianism, particularly in its Neo-Confucian form, because as you know, this is not just about Confucianism in its more sort of deeper epistemological format. This is very much about the Neo-Confucian invention, which is what creates both the Joseon state and the Ming state in China in many ways. Someone was asking me during one of the Harvard lectures how I would define, since I know you're interested in these things, the difference between Confucianism and Neo-Confucianism. And I was very hesitant in answering this because I had my then colleague at Harvard, Peter Bull, who is one of the leading experts on Neo-Confucian theory, sitting in the audience. But I tried my hand at it with Peter, so slightly nodding, I think, in the background, saying that Neo-Confucianism is Confucianism for human beings. It's about finding rules and practical rules and regulations whereby you develop a society and build a state. Maybe with an emphasis on the latter, right? And that, I think, has been over a long period of time more visible in Korea, as we indicated earlier on, than anywhere else. Ming was pretty Neo-Confucian in terms of its orientation, but it pales in comparison with the Joseon experience, in which this Neo-Confucian corpus of thinking was everything. I mean, that goes back to Yi Hang-no's text that I mentioned earlier on. The world was understood in these terms. I think quite a lot of that remains in Korea, but in different forms. So, you know, just like any other, as I would call it, social philosophy, or for that matter, religion, or whatever you want to bring into the mix, it doesn't come just in one form. I mean, there are different ways of understanding this and different ways of emphasizing it. North Korea emphasizes the hierarchical approach, right? That is there. And also, I think you heard me read this in Yi Hang-no's note, you know, that there is a certain family connection to how well you understand issues. So it's not, in many ways, not surprising that North Korea has become the world's first dynastic communist state. I mean, that is the influence of this particular Neo-Confucian background. The idea that if you have studied over generations and achieved great insights over generations that propels you into a position of leadership. Right? But also in South Korea, very interestingly, so one of the things that you find many South Koreans emphasizing is self-cultivation as a part of the Confucian background. So the idea that you're responsible not just for yourself, but for your society and eventually your state. So during the protest in South Korea against the dictatorship, particularly the student protest, you saw a great deal of that, right? That you're not just responsible to yourself and to your family, you're responsible for your whole society. And if not, you break away from that Confucian learning about improvement. So yeah, I mean, on the Chinese side, I've less to say. I mean, I think my new project that I'm working on now, very different from this one, is a history of China's reform and opening process. So it's basically a history of the origins, where this came from. So I'm looking at the 1970s and early to mid 1980s to try to catch some of this. And of course, if you look at China back then, you find a society that is much further removed from these Confucian roots than what Korea would be, either north or south. Confucianism has had in a certain form, has had a bit of a renaissance in China, but it's still, to some extent, cut off from those roots, right, in the earlier phase.
I think that's very generous of you to say it has a renaissance.
Some people argue that it
has. Great, thank you so much. We have another question from R. Stratton. Oh, there we go.
Okay, am I unmuted? Thank you, Professor. This is a wonderful experience, and I'm very grateful to you and to Carol and Devin and the Yale Center. A quick question. I'm curious about resemblances between treaty negotiation efforts on China's part in the latter 1800s and this ancient wisdom of playing the barbarian off the barbarian. Do you see any similarities there? You're grinning.
Absolutely, I see a lot of similarities there, and I think, look, I mean, this is actually something that is really, really important, and I see an interest among Yale students, both undergraduates and graduate students, in this, in trying to understand why people like Li Hongjiang and others who are negotiating with outside powers, first and foremost the European powers, the United States and Japan, but also elsewhere, the continuation of older traditions in Chinese diplomacy, but also much that was pointing forward. The idea of trying to play different outside powers off against each other, but also the very high degree of success that these people had in doing so. So that's what is often forgotten today. I mean, going back to something Devin said earlier on, perhaps even more in China than elsewhere, right? So in China, you have this idea of I forget how long it is now, but 100 years or 150 years of humiliation. Well, you know, these people, Chinese leaders in the late 19th century, were pretty good at setting up their own directions and their own negotiation strategies. And first of all, was tremendously successful in protecting Chinese coherence in terms of its general the general format of its state, but also the physical shape of the empire. So I mean, I find it really difficult to think of 100 years of humiliation, and then finding a People's Republic today that looks so remarkably in form, like the Qing Empire in the late 19th century. So these people must have done something right, in order to make sure that China didn't suffer the fate that so many other countries did in terms of being colonized and divided up.
Right.
So to me, sometimes this idea of 100 years of humiliation, it's a little bit like those historians who said that, you know, the Byzantine Empire spent 1,000 years in constant decline. Well, that's pretty good. You know, if you spend 1,000 years in constant decline, you're still there at the end of it, right? Something like that could be said for imperial or even republican China too.
Well, thank you very much, Professor.
My pleasure.
Thank you. We're going to throw more countries into the mix here with this next question. Julian.
So this actually is another follow-up. So you can't really talking about the China-Korean relationship without talking about Japan. But I find you didn't mention Japan at all. So I was wondering how Japan play a role in terms of the China-Korean relationship.
I didn't mention Japan, but I didn't have time to go into it in any depth. Yeah, so it's obviously true that this is, in many ways, has been historically, is today a triangular relationship. It is really interesting here to look at how young Koreans, young South Koreans, because those are the ones we can understand more about through public opinion polls and those kinds of things, understand the kind of neighborhood that they live in and how changeable that has been. So it doesn't come as a surprise to anyone that young Koreans do not think very highly of Japan. Japan, after all, colonized their country, has subjected it to its rule, or even worse than that, they tried to wipe out this sense of Korean nation, you know, which is much worse than the occupation itself from a Korean perspective. I mean, if you have a very strong, the way I explained it this morning, very strong concept of nation going way back, and you are occupied by someone who tried to destroy that concept, you know, that's much worse than just the occupation itself. But even so, it's interesting to see how these opinions fluctuate. So when I first started going to and teaching in South Korea, almost 30 years ago now, this was at a time when young South Koreans believed very firmly that China, in the period of opening and reform, would enable Korea to move faster in the direction of reunification and at least towards some kind of good relationship between the North and the South, knowing how dependent the North, after all, is in material terms on China. And that mixed, I think, with some of these traditional approaches that I discussed earlier on in creating a very strongly positive view of China among young South Koreans. So I always try to discuss this in my classes, and this is not just my own observations, it's borne out by public opinion polls as well. China was the most highly regarded country 30 years ago, 25 years ago, among young South Koreans. Much higher than the United States, which had seen as having supported dictatorship in South Korea and was tainted by that. And Japan was right down at the bottom. Right? Now this has changed. So at the moment, Japan is still the country that young South Koreans like the least. But China and the United States have fallen to almost the same level in terms of the perception of young people in South Korea. So I wonder what kind of outcome this will have. So I said this is very changeable, as all public opinions are. So one has to be careful with seeing the future in it. But it is still quite a remarkable trend, right? And it's a trend that actually might point towards relations between Korea and Japan continuing to be quite bad, which I think is likely. But that will not mean an improvement in Korea's relationship with any of the other big powers. Right? And the consequences of that are quite interesting when you think about this from a South Korean perspective, particularly the very strong link that used to exist between South Korea and the United States. Some of which is still there, but I think it has been dramatically weakened. And the hopes that China would be the one rescuing Korea in a way from its more recent history. Most of that is also gone. So maybe a more inward turn in these terms, which is interesting as well.
Okay.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Anybody else have any questions? Feel free to keep typing them or raising your hand. I guess in the meantime, I'll ask another one. Sort of since we've talked about Japan, I guess, and the influence of the US and China and Japan, what is your sense of how North and South Korea view each other in terms of how they relate to other countries? And, you know, does one sort of see themselves, I mean, I guess they both see themselves as more central or more Korean, but sort of how do they play that off of each other, and how they relate to other I guess third countries?
That's really interesting, because as in most things that I like to think about, there is a history there in terms of how these two states see themselves and the leaderships see themselves. I mean, this idea that each one of them, from their own perspective, is the last best hope for the Korean nation, is something that probably has only got stronger over the past 20 years, right? Both in terms of the sense of legitimacy, but also the sense that they have something crucial connected to their state that the other side cannot deliver. And it's interesting that this makes any kind of politically negotiated settlement of the relationship between the two almost unimaginable. It doesn't preclude a dramatic reduction in tension, which certainly was the aim of the new Korean president, not so new anymore, President Moon, when he came into power. But it also means, I think, that the outcome of this relationship will probably have to be reunification based on the principles of one or the other side. And at the moment, I think it's almost impossible to foresee that could be anything else than the Republic of Korea. In terms of, you know, what has been achieved. I must confess, I'm a great admirer of South Korea. You know, over the past 25 years in that country. But also, of course, the relative lack of success in terms of domestic development that you see in North Korea, with the one exception of nuclear weapons. So, in spite of these irreconcilable differences, detente is possible under certain circumstances, but not more than that. I mean, the idea that we should, both from a position of strength, negotiate their way to a unified Korea, I think is next to impossible. So we are looking at some kind of breakdown scenario. My sense is that breakdown would happen in the north. We don't know when, we don't know the format of it. Most of the Chinese experts, by the way, who I worked with on this tend to agree with this. They always warn against, I mean, rightly, against Western analysts saying, you know, North Korea is doomed, and then of course North Korea continues existing for a long period after that. But when you bring it down to basics, when you bring it down to, you know, how survivable in the longer run is the North Korean state, I think they tend to agree with this. Never say it publicly, of course, but that's the sort of view, which places, to go back to an earlier question, places China's Korea policy in a really difficult spot. So one of the things that irritates me on the US side with regard to its understanding, Washington's understanding of China's Korea policy, is that this is really hard from Beijing's perspective, right? So you may criticize the Chinese government for some of its choices. I would too, with regard to North Korea. But whatever way you want to take this, it is really difficult. Right? It's difficult because it's a neighbor. It's difficult because part of the country is now armed with nuclear weapons. It's difficult because successive generations of American leaders believe that China has much more direct influence in North Korea than what it actually has. Right? And then, of course, you add to that the fear, which I find echoes of both in Ming and Qing China, of being humiliated by a smaller neighbor. Right? If you try to lay down the law and nothing happens, well, that's bad. You know, for a great power, and particularly something, you know, particularly for a country that sees itself as the rising power in Eastern Asia and probably on a global scale. You know, if you try to tell your little brother next door to do something and nothing happens, that's really, really bad. Right? So it is a difficult position to be in. It's a really difficult position to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I think with China, it's always a question of how much saving face plays into how they understand their role. I think the next question has somewhat related to that, so I'll go ahead and let Arshan ask that. Still muted. Hold on.
Okay.
There you go.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry to be selfish, Professor. I don't know what time it is where you are, but I appreciate your entertaining a further question. I'm curious about the issue of identity. It seems identity seems to me to be a driving force, a focal point in any kind of understanding of relations between people. Especially in that part of that region. So first question was, how much was the Chinese or identity, how large was it in the subconscious, and why, if I might, did they not really take Japan's model seriously? I found some references. I'm sorry, I'm not an expert and specialist, but instances where as early as the 1860s, they're pointing to the Japanese movement. Why would that have been a problem? Was Japan as contemptible as the West in terms of the view?
No, that's a very, very good question. I think for part of the story that I'm telling in this book, and also in an earlier book when I spoke about, the one called Restless Empire, where I talk about China's relationship with the outside world over a longer time period. So if you look at the time period after the Taiping Rebellion, or the Great Rebellions of the mid-19th century, one of the things that I find striking is both the force, the power of what Chinese call the self-strengthening movement. So the ability to build on knowledge and practices that are imported from elsewhere and put them to use for the Qing Empire is very, very strong. In many ways, at least in the early phase, as dynamic, if not more dynamic than what you find in Japan. But, and this goes to the core of your question, the Qing Empire is not Japan. It is a very different kind of entity, and it's held together, and its identity, its self-understanding, is held together by an ideology that is based on the kind of Neo-Confucian principles that we have talked about so much during this discussion. It isn't possible, I think, for that generation of leaders of the Qing, whoever they are, whether they be Manchu or Chinese or Mongolian or Korean for that matter. There are lots of Koreans who were working with the Qing, or other groups. Possible to give up this Confucian part of the identity. And I find the discussions in late 19th century China fascinating on this. So if some people argue, if we become entirely Westernized, haven't we then lost haven't we lost more than if we stick to our principles, try to make use of as much as we can of Western technology and science?
Right.
And they were really good at doing that, right?
Right.
But for different purposes than what would be the Western understanding of a society and a state. So I think that format stayed on in China for reasons that are not all that difficult to understand. While in Japan, it was pushed to the side.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, when you get to the 20th century, beyond the changes that took place in China with the fall of the Qing, the framework seems to be slightly reversed, right? Because what China does is that it takes over eventually an entirely imported ideology, Marxism, and become a Marxist state in terms of its framework. While Japan increasingly retrogresses back to ideas and ideals that had been very strong in the period before Japan became in form, entirely Westernized.
Right.
Interesting. If there is someone among you who write books and articles, you should write on that. That's a fascinating topic.
Well, it's I teach high school students, so I have to simplify a great deal, and the danger always is.
But when you teach college students as well, I can tell you, you have to simplify.
No, so there's always the danger of oversimplifying when you try to simplify for the sake of understanding, and the nuance can only be grappled with to a certain degree. But I appreciate your entertaining the questions and that I've offered here, and I think it's fascinating that even the proponents of change in China, with such as the self-strengthening and so forth, there was this deep reticence. It was almost a resignation that if we're going to make change, well, maybe this is really not what we want to do, and we're going to do it for reasons that are less than noble.
Yes.
If we're going to be true to ourselves and what we value.
That's exactly it. No, that is exactly it, and that's something that is not much understood, I think, including in China itself today. I mean, what a lot of Chinese see is Qing weakness, and of course this remarkable emphasis that there is in Chinese textbooks today. I was just actually reading just yesterday a Chinese high school textbook on the Qing as an entirely foreign dynasty imposed on China from the outside, and that all the errors and failures were entirely down to the Manchu and their devilishness. Which is a very different way of understanding, I think, the Qing than what was the contemporary understanding from Chinese and other groups.
Right. Thank you very much. It was, I appreciate that, and I'm sorry to be taking up a lot of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, this is one of the fun things about doing this over Zoom is we get to have more interaction like this.
It's wonderful. I mean, there's nothing I enjoy more than discussing with a group who have a diverse background. Now, I wouldn't say that all of our Yale students are not diverse, but they certainly have more in common in terms of age and probably also where they come from than what some of the groups that I've been speaking to since the current situation started on Zoom. So I really enjoy this.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you very much again, Professor.
Thank you.
Exactly. So I think with that, we will close now officially. Thank you everybody for participating and for asking wonderful questions. And, this is obviously going to be a topic that we'll be revisiting, I'm sure. So hopefully that this has helped many of us sort of understand this current situation better. And I think as Professor Westad pointed out, as historians, you often get asked questions about, so what is the future going to be like based on history, and you try to extrapolate, and you know, very humbly and truly we have to say.
So what I usually say on that, Devin, Carol and all, is that historians are not better in foreseeing the future than anyone else. But what historians can do, should do, is to alert more people to the parallels that might be there with the past. So you can't predict the future by studying the past, but the past can sensitize you to certain patterns that have existed. And that, I think, is really important, because it tells you maybe first and foremost, as this story that we talked about today does, about limitations. You know, what can be done and what cannot be done, right? And that's important to know. Particularly important in the United States, that people know something more about that. And maybe especially on the side of what cannot be done.
Right. All right. So I think that's a great note to end on. And so I'm going to unmute everybody. And if you are willing, please open up your video so that we can take a group photo, as the proper Chinese thing to do would be. Go ahead and turn on your video camera, and I'll also unmute everybody so you guys can say thank you to Professor Westad, as well as thank him and you know, show whatever appreciation you would like.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor. I appreciate your